Curator. Hans Leon Torres, the Indigenous Futures Research Center research coordinator, will be our moderator today, and I'll pass it over to Hans. Hans, welcome.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Doug, for that introduction. My name is Hans Lujan Torres. I am a curator and researcher and art historian from Cusco, Peru, and I'm a settler here in Jojage. And I am so honored to be moderating this panel with two folks that I really respect and value, Hannah Claus and Michelle McGeough. I want to thank everyone who's joining us here in person and just say hello to everyone who's joining us online via Zoom and further afield through our YouTube live stream. So I'll just outline the proceedings for the next little while, and then we'll get started. So I'm going to read out the biographies for our presenters, and then each will do about a 10-minute presentation, and that'll be followed by a Q&A that I'll be moderating. And so we'll pass around the microphone for questions in the audience. If there's anyone online who wants to ask a question, just write it in the chat, and Doug or someone else will be asking it on your behalf. Okay, so let's get started. So first up will be Dr. Michelle McGeough, who is Cree Métis settler and who completed her PhD in Indigenous art history at the University of New Mexico. Prior to returning to school for her advanced degree, she taught museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Art and was the assistant curator at the Wheelwright Museum of the Native American Indian in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Dr. McGeough has a master's degree from Carleton University, as well as a BFA from Emily Carr and an undergraduate degree from the Institute of American Indian Art. She also has a BEd degree from the University of Alberta, and Dr. McGeough currently teaches at Concordia University in the art history department. And we're also joined by Professor Hannah Claus, who is a transdisciplinary artist of Kanien'kehá:ka English heritage and who engages in Ongwe epistemology to highlight the ways of understanding and being in relation with the world. A 2019 Iliong Fellow and the 2020 recipient of the Prix Giverny. Recent group exhibitions include Feturangita at the Daus in Aotearoa, the touring exhibition Radical Stitch, which was at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, and Plastic Heart at the University of Toronto Art Gallery and the Centre Curatorial Canadian in Paris, France. Professor Claus is an associate professor in frameworks and interventions in Indigenous art practice in the Department of Studio Arts at Concordia University and research chair in Ongwe She is a member of the Kintete Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawks of the Bay of Kinte and is the interim co-director of the IFRC. Welcome to you both. And I guess we'll get started with Michelle.
All right. So hopefully this won't be too boring. But this is actually, I'm sorry. I just came from teaching, and it's just like I've been talking all day, and it's like, oh my goodness. What can I say that would interest people anymore? But specifically, what I'm going to be talking about is Indigenous curatorial methods, and in particular, thinking about my own thoughts on this. And much of this is actually informed or was written about a long time ago in 2012. And it was an article that I wrote following a presentation that I made at a conference. And I was asked, would you put it into an article? Would you be interested in putting it into an article? And it was talking about, when we talk about Indigenous curation, what do we mean by that? What makes it different than other forms of curation? And so a lot of my discussion or thinking about this notion of Indigenous curatorial methods was actually informed by two different experiences I had at the time. The first one was working at the Wheelwright Museum of Native American Indian in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I was hired to create an exhibition that involved looking at the paintings that were created by students that attended the Santa Fe Indian School. And the other experience was when I actually left the Wheelwright Museum and took a position teaching at the Institute of American Indian Art, and in particular, teaching within the Museum Studies program. And so the notion was, and when we were developing the curriculum, is how do we curate differently than institutional spaces have curated about Indigenous people in the past. And so when I was curating this exhibition, one of the things that we did is we formulated an advisory committee. This was made up of artists who were the adult children of individuals that attended the Santa Fe Indian School, as well as individuals who had been students at the Santa Fe Indian School that were elders. And each group kind of advised me on different aspects of the exhibition. For the elders, it was some of the images that were painted had to do with ceremony. And so it was like, are these things that should be shown, to the public? Are these things that would be okay for other people to see? And then the other advisory committee was more or less helping me to make connections within the community, to introduce me to people, to introduce me to families who had, whose parents had attended the Santa Fe Indian School. And as a result of this, it had a really big impact in terms of how I curated the exhibition. And it also had some really interesting things and conversations that came out of the exhibition that really indicated to me how, for instance, Indigenous people sometimes encounter themselves in these spaces. And one of the things in particular was often when these works were shown, they were done in a linear fashion. They were done according to year. And what was really important is that the advisory group said, these are often activities that occur on a seasonal basis. And so rather than actually doing it in the fashion of doing it like by year and when they were created, I actually then grouped the works to reflect an Indigenous worldview, and that time was cyclical, and that, this idea that things renewed and things continued, and it wasn't, this line up and then things end. And so that was one of the things that I really noticed about, and this was actually my first job as a curator. I was freshly out of grad school, and it was a real important pivotal moment for me to understand that what I was taught as a master's student, as being curatorial, practices, that there are ways that we as Indigenous people could intervene in these, and so tell a much fuller story from an Indigenous point of view, and also provide these instances where individuals saw themselves and could see themselves in these spaces. So this is kind of an example of, some of the work. What was really interesting, and I wanted to point out, and the reason why I have this particular painting is Laurencita. I got to speak with Laurencita's son, who himself is a well-known artist. And he talked about how seeing these paintings gave him a whole other insight into his mother. He had never known his mother to paint, but she did when she was a student at the Indian School. And he said, what I understood and I knew what my mother did was the embroidery. And so this actually gave him, like going back and seeing these paintings, and his experience in encountering these paintings was an opportunity for him to actually have a different kind of understanding of his mother at a moment in time. And the other image that I'm showing here is just kind of like the wall text, and then the arrangement of these paintings according to season. So this is the winter season. So when I was thinking about, curation and what does it mean as Indigenous people in terms of our curatorial practice, what are some of the things that is really different? And so what came up for me was this idea of mentorship, the notion of community consultation, accountability, and reciprocity. And these ideas were informed by two individuals, Nancy Marie Mitlow and Ryan Rice, who at the time was at the Museum of, it was at IIA's museum, the Museum of Contemporary Indigenous Art. And then, of course, at that same time, you have shortly happening after that was the opening of the National Museum of the Native American Indian. And so a lot of the practices that they were doing is this whole idea of consultation with community. And so that was some of the things that kind of informed the thinking that went into that article. And of course, you always have this opportunity as things and you get more experience to think about other examples or other, and like I said, different kinds of models and guidelines that are now being utilized today. I did not make this model up. This is someone else's work. But in thinking about how do we as Indigenous people, as curators, there's this idea of accountability, ancestral accountability, especially if we're working with entities that have been in collections and collected very early, what museums refer to as artifacts, the notion of accessibility, thinking about who is absent, who is not coming into these spaces, and of course building relationships, community, following protocol, and of course care. And this kind of leads to my more recent projects with Daphne. And, talking about relationships, in that I had this opportunity to work with the 4 founding members of Daphne and to put together this exhibition, which was the inaugural exhibition as we moved into the new space. I'm also a board member along with Hannah. And so, talking about a community, talking about reciprocity, talking about, our relationships, and particularly the Indigenous community is not as big as we think it is, and that, we often know each other. We often know and have relationships outside of these spaces. And so there is a sense of being accountable to each other in terms of the our responsibilities and also to what we're putting out there. And so I was very privileged to actually work on this exhibition. And I say work on it because even though I was the curator, I was more like a facilitator. And so that's what I'm thinking, in terms of when we're talking about Indigenous methods of curation. It's Indigenous because I'm doing it. But it's also this notion of being a facilitator, and that you don't actually have this grand narrative and that you create this story. And but it's actually, this was very different for me because each artist is well known, has a practice, and it was actually, they're all very, very busy. And it was like looking at the works that they had and how do I create a story around that? And so the exhibition itself was talking about being Daphne, talking about being in community and consultation. We're on Ganagahaga territory. We were looking at the languages. So, everything that we do at Daphne is in 4 languages, in recognition of the territory that we're in, recognition of community. And so thinking about, some of those ideas and how, these ideas are put into practice. These are some of the works that were included in that particular exhibition. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is actually a project that is coming up. And in particular, as an Indigenous queer, two-spirited individual, I'm starting to think about what is it about the way that I curate that might have certain understandings that have been informed by, some really important thinkers in the world of Indigenous studies, also in relation to settler studies, and thinking about the next generation. And are there specific needs that, Two-Spirit Indigenous queer people have in these institutional spaces? So a lot of this comes from an exhibition that I have coming up in 2026. It's tentatively titled Love Medicine. It's going to be opening at the Mackenzie Art Gallery and actually then opening at OCAD, and specifically looking at the artistic production of queer and Indigenous queer artists. And another project is so another project that that's coming up is we're doing an emerging curators workshop, which is being partially funded by Dr. Heather Iglesias' research chair. And we're thinking about these ideas of accountability, ancestral accountability, accessibility, in terms of thinking of a new generation of curators and how do we create these spaces for these curators. So that's basically it.
Wow. Thank you so much. Round of applause for that. And next up is Hannah.
So how does this work?
Should be shared in your screen.
Okay.
There we
Sorry,
go.
the mouse is like jumping everywhere. Is it because someone else is controlling it?
Anna, that was me.
Okay. I don't know what's going on.
Hopefully it's okay now.
Okay. It's really nice to be seeing y'all. So I've been working on this project as a curator. I think it's pretty clear I'm not usually a curator. I do a little bit of curation. I really like how you talked about that as facilitator. I think that's great. So I started off my presentation just with this idea of curatorial epistemology between Greg Stotts and Hannah Claus as this way of kind of getting around the word curation. And most importantly, it's from Hannah Claus's perspective. I don't necessarily want to speak for Greg. So, Nahoda sa Tgatu Chi Niohahes is the name of the title. Is the name of the exhibition, the title of the exhibition. What have you seen along the way? So my collaboration with Greg began last year when I brought him to Concordia as a part of a speakers series we were running at Post Image. I've always been a fan of his work and was thrilled to have him share it with the Concordia community. This is the image that was on the poster for his talk, and I just found it incredibly powerful. It's the roots of a white pine. And the white pine is the tree that's the symbol of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Peacemaker says, those who want to join the Confederacy may follow the white roots of peace. In this exhibition, Nahodan Sat Gatu Ti Niho Hafes, what have you seen along the way? Greg's work speaks about balance, juxtaposing images of chaos and order, seeking a restorative balance between the two. This is grounded in Haudenosaunee ways of being. These are images that are personal and also universal. The suggested methods of establishing order derive from an understanding of what constitutes a good mind and the medicines that bring healing and renewal. Mnemonic imagery, objects, and metaphorical tropes that are particular to Haudenosaunee, such as the longhouse, wampum, and rafters, appear throughout. Overall, the exhibition is his recounting of his journey, and it's also an invitation for us to join him. I'm ending with the image that actually will begin the exhibition. This stands as a marker at the door, a sign to leave colonial questioning behind. These words are written with oil, earth, and tobacco ash. Dolga, shrugging shoulders. It means I don't know, and is repeated over and over and over to form a protective wall. It underscores the gallery as a separate sacred space, one where these dialogues can exist in an Indigenous space. Tukniakwanagi, these are all my words. Yawa.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Hannah. Okay. Thank you both for that for your fascinating presentations. I have a couple of notes and just words that I was writing down as I was listening to both of them, and things that were kind of parallel in those were this idea of responsibility, place being really important in the exhibitions that you talked about, collaboration, accountability, and reciprocity. And I guess one thing that I was thinking is just you both have these respective practices alongside curating. Hannah, you have your own artistic practice, and Michelle, you're a well-respected art historian. But I was also seeing in your bio that you did a BFA. And when I was reflecting back on Indigenous curators that I respect, I was realizing that a lot of them started off as artists or have an artist background. And I'm curious, how does your artistic practice inform your curatorial practice? Do you see them as separate? Are they kind of all in one? Yeah, I'll maybe start there.
I'm a failed artist. You know, in terms of, I think that what you recognize is very much similar amongst many of us that are in the curatorial field that are Indigenous.
Yeah.
And that a lot of that has to do with the history in terms of there not being, you know, having to knock down doors in order to get into those institutional spaces. And so in order for your work to be seen, so a lot of people had to become very active and activists in terms of promoting Indigenous art, for Indigenous art to be seen as art and not an ethnographic curiosity kind of thing. And so I think, you know, that is a part of the history in art history is the involvement of artists in terms of trying to create spaces for the work to be seen. You have, you know, like so many, like you mentioned, so many people have had that. And in terms of whether or not, you know, my artistic practice informs, like I do it for fun, I do it for pleasure, you know, now, rather than feeling that I have to produce something in order to make a living, to feed myself. And so I think that, and one of the reasons why I find having an art background is so helpful is because I understand the materials. I understand, I can look at something, I can appreciate it. You know, I love, you know, putting my hand into a pot and being able to feel the, you know, the marks left by the maker's hands, those kinds of things. I understand, you know, the effort that goes into creating a piece of, even like I studied pottery, I studied silversmithing, I ended up in photography and film. So I understand those mediums, and I understand the work and the idea, and, you know, just the germination of an idea and making it into something concrete. To me, is just like fascinating. And every time that happens, it's a celebration. And so I think that really kind of informs a lot of my curatorial practice, but also as an art historian, in that I have this great appreciation for the artist, and actually, it's amazing to be able to take something that's just an idea and to create something in a concrete form for other people to enjoy. What a gift that is! And so, I think that that's basically what has informed my practice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I'm really an occasional. I think I've curated maybe 3 exhibitions, like a title as curator, but I think that's the thing with where I've taken it on. It's because I feel like the artists either have not had a chance to be seen, and I really want them to be seen. And in the case with this exhibition here, Greg was just so excited about Daphne, the fact that it's an Indigenous artist-run center, the fact that it's an Indigenous space. And I feel like, I think the reason why I showed how I showed his work this show is it's really talking to it as someone who's understands Rodinishoni, it's the Confederacy. So Greg is Tuscarora, I'm Ganikahaga, but we have this similar understanding and language. We have a similar framework that we work within. And so we can kind of just cut through a lot of extra superfluous stuff and just get into that. And I think it's the way that he was excited to be shown and I was excited to show his work that draws on those ideas, you know? So that was sort of my thing, where when he's like, well, who's going to curate me? And I was like, well, I guess I could if I can do you honor, kind of thing. But it also very much, I just kind of laugh and kind of shrug off the idea of curating, because really he knew what he was going to show. I didn't choose anything. But we discussed the work together of what he wanted to show, and we had lots of really wonderful conversations that, you know, sort of drew things out. I'd show him what I'm writing, he'd make some comments, we'd have another talk, I'd show him again. So it is this idea of relationship, reciprocity. I think that does exist perhaps more with Indigenous curators and artists. And I think that that's something where, as you're saying, as an Indigenous artist, I've had people say to me that you know, that are curators, that they don't feel that they can curate Indigenous art because they don't know it, you know, that and they don't want to do it wrong, but then they're not going to show it. And then that's like, well, that's just not okay as an answer, because then you're not going to be shown, right? So I think there's part of it. It's still that creating spaces for us within Indigenous spaces, but also within the colonial spaces. It's really important to have presence within all these different spaces. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm picking up is, and just thinking about the history of curating, it has such a colonial baggage to it. And, you know, historically, a curator has been someone who takes on an authoritative and authorship of an artist's work or a particular theme. And what I'm kind of seeing in Indigenous methodologies to curating is that collaboration, consultation, these sorts of working alongside the artist as opposed to this hierarchy, those roles are kind of blurred, and it allows for something more. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about that, Hannah, in your collaborations with Greg, and Michelle with your with that exhibition you talked about at the very beginning. In those processes, and how do they just come naturally to you, or did you find that from your previous experiences?
Great. The lines of hierarchy being blurred.
Of a curator having that authoritative role, you know, like you mentioned, you're working with Greg, and he's doing the selection, but you're there to support him and to assist him when needed. So it's not one over the other, but working together. That's how I'm understanding it. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
There is no hierarchy.
Yeah.
It's really it's supporting. I want him to have a fabulous experience and a fabulous show. He deserves it. His work is amazing. And that is also, I think, why we created Daphne. It's really to cater to the artists and their needs, to have them feel like this space is their space. And, you know, that depending on the artist can vary a little bit from here to there, but it's always, you know, talking and listening, very much listening and respecting what the artist would like.
Yeah.
That first exhibition was like, I had not even finished graduate school when I got the job.
Wow.
So that was my very first exhibition. And I was very fortunate in terms of, I had no preconceived notions of what a curator was. I didn't grow up spending a lot of time in museum spaces. I think maybe a field trip once every, you know, like 2 years as a kid. And it was to, you know, the local, you know, provincial museum. So this was not even a career that I even thought of or considered. And then all of a sudden it was on a whim,
Okay.
you know, kind of thought, oh, I'll apply for the job. You know, it's just what could happen, you know, and then they offered it to me and it's just like, okay, now I have, you know, some work ahead of me, but, had no preconceived notions. And I just think part of it is the recognition that I was in a place that was not my home territory. I'm from Alberta, I'm Métis. That's what I understand. That's what I know. And so being in, you know, the territory of the Pueblo people, I'm not an authority. I know nothing. And so I'm a blank slate. And it was, how do I do this? My sense of responsibility. How do I do this in a way that really honors these communities, these families, these relationships? And so I kind of fell into it. And so it was more intuitive than it was like I presented that model, a checklist, you know, and I always kind of like, models are good and they're guidelines, but they're not something that you just kind of go through and you check a list, you know, go through it. And yeah, so yeah, I would just say that it was more of an intuitive kind of thing and a recognition that I'm not an authority on anything
Yeah.
really, you know.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I will take this time to open it up to the audience to see if we have any questions. Maybe in the chat. We can give you more time too. Anyone? Maybe while we're waiting for that question, I'm also curious about mentorship. Michelle, you mentioned these different aspects to mentorship or that you're involved with, but also recognizing you're both professors, you're both full-time professors working with so many students. Again, do you see mentorship differently after being a professor and having that responsibility? When you have, you know, it's these sort of relationships come to you and it's a group of students coming to you for mentorship. How are you finding that in your practices as artists and curators?
Mentorship in my practices as artist and curator.
I guess to filter that, I just feel like it's very difficult to master and to give space to.
I think, I don't know if I can speak to it as much in a role as curator. Just like I said, I don't
Yeah.
have as much experience as curator. As an artist and as a professor or teacher, I think it's helping people to figure out how to find their creative solutions and their creative voices that I find really exciting about teaching in studio arts in any case. And I think the other thing is sort of coming back. I graduated from Concordia over 20 years ago. No, okay, 20 years ago, actually. It was 2004. From the master's, the MFA program. And I think coming back now and being in the position I am, the thing that is really exciting is to feel like I can develop courses that I would have liked as an Indigenous student 20 years ago that just did not exist. And having Indigenous students get so excited about those courses is just makes it all worth it. I mean, that's just a huge thrill. So it's really the idea of being here to sort of support as best I can for whatever they need, the Indigenous artists that are coming up and coming through now, you know. And I guess that kind of lends itself with Daphne as well. That's what we want to have as a space also.
Pass the baton. I'm still working on the whole notion of being a mentor. And I find it really overwhelming because I'm trying to be a mentor. I'm trying to take up a space in an institution and also involved in community. And I do it more organically. And I'm, you know, like I don't set out, to mentor people. I have students, I have graduate students, I have undergraduate students. And I'm struggling with being a mentor because I feel that there's so much for me to learn and so much for me to know. My family has no background in academia. I'm the first one. So I'm trying to figure out things too. I'm trying to figure out that pathway. And so what I hope that I'm doing is kind of clearing a little bit of the pathway, and each student is going to make their own way in the institution. It's like, I'm here and I got my foot in the door, and if you want to come in, come in. And I will, try to make, space for you, pathways, but I'm struggling with it. I'm struggling with trying to be a good mentor, because sometimes, your ego gets in it, and you're a human being, and it's trying to balance all that. And it's not easy, because, at the root of it, we're all trying to be good human beings. And we do have our off days. And we're just trying to, do our best. And we're in institutions that basically didn't really want us here or really welcome us, or, so in many ways, we're forging new directions and new ways. And we're even forcing the institution to kind of bend a little bit. And so, like I said, a lot of energy right now is, I have the foot in the door, and I'm trying to keep it open. And if this is a place where you want to be, then, come on in. It's not going to be easy, but certainly, I think we're gathering, critical mass. And I think even within the curatorial field, we're gathering critical mass, and that becomes much easier, but then we'll have a new set of problems.
Just speaking into this, I think
Yeah.
that's part of like the beauty of the IFRC is that we're now able to come together like that. That idea of critical mass. I mean, the fact that we've got this research center is just one of those steps for sure along the way. But I was just thinking, because I was listening to your talk, and then when I was writing my notes last night, and this isn't related necessarily to that, but I just wanted to say, I wondered if you could talk about that, we were talking about this yesterday, that idea of sort of chaos and order, or, good and bad in that sense, and how that's one of those things that you have come across in your exhibitions as this notion to kind of get entangled with. I was just thinking of that because I was looking at Greg's work, and that's very much something he was talking about, was this idea of chaos and order, and trying to keep a balance, and how that's just a different concept, a different Indigenous concept than a non-Indigenous person would look at. Is that okay if you talk about that?
Yeah. So Hannah and I, regularly meet, both because we're Daphne, but also because she's kind of like my lifeline within the institutions. And yeah, and just talking about the notion of order and chaos, and that they are both the same, and that there are moments when things are in disorder. But then, it kind of switches in terms to like this energy flow, and that it kind of weaves, and there's these ebbs and these flows where certain things will come into our focus. And then a lot of this has to do with, for example, we were talking about the exhibition Love Medicine, and how the notion of love medicine within some Indigenous communities can be seen as very negative. And so we were talking about, how do we kind of change that? How do we think about, both the good and the bad, in terms of accepting, the things that are negative, and also understanding that things change throughout time, perceptions change throughout time. And so it's not an either or a binary, but it's the same. It's the underside of the same coin kind of thing. And thinking about that, and in particular, this notion that everything's complementary. And it's like, but at certain moments, something might seem as if it's taking over, but then it swings back, kind of thing. So we're talking about this, how do we kind of balance that? And how do we think in a way that frames it in this manner? And it becomes kind of like an understanding, in a way, a philosophy of life. And it's just, as you get older, it's just like, how do you kind of mediate everything that you could possibly be involved in? And you pick and you choose. And how do you also, what's the word for it? You pick and you choose, and you decide where you're spending your energies. And you get more, you begin to understand that you have this finite amount of time. And so as a consequence, you want to spend your time working on those things. And so, and how much your own attitude has to do with that. So, I don't know if yeah.
I think what you're saying
That's great.
there is even very much like the title of the exhibition, of Greg's exhibition, What Have You Seen Along the Way? That is what the Peacemaker asked Hayawata, as Hayawata is going to the different communities to try and bring them in to have them open, to bring this message of peace and have them join the Confederacy. And it's, what have you seen along the way? And it's very much this idea of a path that we're walking, and what are you going to bring back? What are you bringing back to share and paint the larger overall picture? So yeah, I just thought there was really, nice similarities as Onwehonwe that we share in this sense, and really kind of complex, because it's a philosophy, but it's reflected in the language, right? It's reflected in the word. It's not a dichotomy. It's something where one is really a part of the other. And it's the church that made it good and bad, or good versus evil, right? And that same philosophy is in the Roronoshoni perspective philosophy as well, as in so many of the Umehome methodologies. So
You articulated it much better than
I think we have time for a question from the audience, if there is one. Oh, yes.
So great conversation so far. You've sort of touched on this in bits and pieces, but I think asking it as a sort of a straight up question, which is, how do you both see your role as researchers working with practice? What is, or another way to think of it is like, what does research mean to the two of you, right? Who have practices that exist outside of an academic institution, right? So what does it mean to bring those practices within this context, and then particularly within the context of a research imperative, right? We're expected to do research. And also curious if the opportunity to at least engage with it explicitly as research is part of the attraction of being here, or is it maybe one of the downsides of being here?
we getting deep. I think kind of easily said is, I feel that kind of like I just talked about with that idea of the trail and walking and, gleaning and reflecting and filtering. Research is really in experience. It's experiential, it's material, it's in conversations, it's in relationships. It kind of happens in everything that I do, and how that then gets kind of filtered through into my practice as a professor, as an artist, or as a curator. I think that's kind of the easiest way to sort of answer that question for me, but also a true way, I think conversations can spawn research, and materials, processes can spawn research. And I think being at Concordia is something where it's maybe the framework that allows you to validate it as such. You know, I'm now able to kind of through presentations like this, panels, be able to say like, check, this now counts as research. And I'm sure Michelle writes about it, right?
Thinking about this, I was just, what struck me is I was thinking about how, within the university system, how research is often defined in a particular way. And I see research more for me becoming about relationships. And, the idea within, this kind of complex, this intellectual kind of complex, it doesn't really value that kind of research in terms of building relationships. And even, when we're having conversations, the exchange that takes place and how important that is. We want to do the kind of research that we get in archives. We want to do the research that, we get in labs, like I'm thinking more like scientific, but we don't talk about the importance of relationships in research. And that without these relationships, we have no research. I think that that's one of the failures of institutions right now, is just that limited view in terms of what constitutes research. Getting that time, I will say that that's been one of the things that has been very difficult for me to do, is because the research takes time. And maybe it's a cop-out, I don't know, but I spend more time often within the institution doing service for the institution than I do research. So that is an issue, especially, when you come up for tenure, and it's just like, oh, you didn't do enough research. And yeah, it takes time. It takes time to, that you really have to carve out. And I will say that, being here, that I've been able to participate in some really groundbreaking ideas regarding research and constructing knowledge, and being here and creating that space for these types of knowledge systems to be recognized within academia, if that's what the student wants. So my own research suffers, but at the same time, it's also recognition that perhaps it isn't time for me. You know what I mean? It's just like, there's other things that are more pressing. And so it's just that kind of recognition that my research might happen when I retire. Thank you for that question.
Anyone else? We have one hand in the far back. Oh, maybe we'll pass the microphone. Oh, wait.
It's not on. Oh, now it's on.
Davina.
Well, anyway, this is more like what I'm thinking. Like, I remember when I was an undergrad student, like 12 years ago, it was very difficult to have an outlet to have my art exhibited. And I was always given cheap excuses. I won't say specifically what, but now, as of recently, most of the shows and exhibitions that I've been was largely with non-Indigenous artists. And I feel like as an Indigenous person, I'm able to be in a white institution like a university, and I'm able to understand what's being taught there. But whenever I have to explain myself, nobody understands me. So my question is, like, now that things are changing, because I noticed that I've been in a lot of shows with artists who are not Native, like largely the majority of them are, would Daphne ever have a show that would have non-Indigenous artists, because I'm thinking of the idea of the medicine wheel and how it represents all cultures. Would it be good to, like, in light of that idea, would Daphne ever host an exhibition where there's no Indigenous, I mean, there's mixed artists in there, but like there's non-Indigenous and Indigenous?
I think I'm gonna say never, you know? I think maybe even Skawanati's project that's coming up next June might be sort of a show that's got a real variety of people in it. I'm not sure, so I can't like completely speak to that, but I'm gonna, yeah, I would say never. I think we're certainly open to always questioning what we do and why we do, and making sure that it reflects what the community wants and needs. But I also want to say the fact that it's an Indigenous space is really very precious to us. There aren't that many, you know? So it's something that we're really happy to have created and is a special thing. Yeah.
Putting on my board member hat. I think that our priority, has been and will also continue to be emerging artists, Indigenous artists, specifically thinking about, that creating that space is like a community space as well. And although we invite other, people to come in, non-Indigenous people to come in, it's really important that, we remain focused on the Indigenous community and, seeing, our responsibility to the Indigenous community, because there's lots of other artist-run centers for non-Indigenous people to participate, but there's only one that we call our home, and so, as Hannah said, never say never. But like our focus has, and I see it continuing to be on Indigenous artists.
Speaking of Daphne, I wonder if Hannah, maybe you can remind us when Greg's exhibition opens.
Oh gosh, yes. I was thinking I should have to like finish with that, but Greg's exhibition opens February 3rd, which is a Saturday. I think it's like at 2:00, something like that in the afternoon, 2 to 4. Yeah. You can always check Daphne's website, daphne.art, and see for sure. But yeah, I hope you can all come out and see. It really is going to be exciting.
Lovely. Yeah, that's next week on the 3rd. I think we'll wrap it up there if everyone's okay with that. Thank you both for all of your thoughts and knowledge, for sharing that with us. Thank you to the audience and for the questions that were shared. And I believe now we're just going to take another little break and then we'll transition into our film screening. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Thanks everyone for coming into the space today. And for those of you online, we're going to be closing up the Zoom now. Those of you in the space, please stick around for the screening, Past Future Forward, Making of a Hawaiian Video Game with Jason Edward Lewis, Graham Sirakmar. And that will be in a few minutes. We're going to have to move some chairs around. So if you have any coffee cups or whatever, please grab them.